good evening, everybody. I am Isabella Rowan, the program coordinator here at Delray Beach Public Library, and it is my pleasure to introduce you, to welcome you to the fourth and final course on our Florida Foodways menu. Florida Foodways, the intersection of food and culture, was a four-part series about various aspects of Florida food and culinary history. Funding for this series was provided by a community grant from Whole Foods Market Delray. The series opened with Dr. Gary Mormino, American historian, author, and current scholar in residence at Florida Humanities. He presented 10 foods that define Florida with a fascinating historical look at foods indigenous to our state. The second course featured Chef Norman Van Aken, an award-winning Florida chef, cookbook author, radio host, and restaurateur. He did a cooking demo with Florida ingredients from his kitchen and then talked about his life as a chef and his love affair with Florida foods. Both of those programs were recorded and they can now be viewed on our library's YouTube channel. Last week, we heard about African and African American foodways in Florida with culinary historian and author Diane Spivey. And we learned, among many things, that it was a fascinating talk, but we learned that fusion cooking is not a 20th century phenomenon. During tonight's program, we will go on an historical tour of Florida Jewish foodways. But before I introduce our speaker, I want to take a moment to tell you about some upcoming programs we have on other Jewish subjects. On Wednesday, May 19th at 7 p.m., we will be screening the documentary by Ryan Koresh. It's called The Passengers, and we will have a talk back with the filmmaker. And it's the story of two men in Ethiopia, they're Ethiopian Jews, who are pursuing their right to immigrate to Israel. And it's a fascinating story. And we have a link for a private screening. So what happens is if you register for the program, I will send you the link to watch the film on your own time and on your own device. And then you can join us for the discussion on Zoom at 7 p.m. on May 19th. The second program that we have coming up is at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, May 25th. And it is the true story of Mossad's fake diving resort. And we have Rafi Berg, the BBC journalist and author of the book Red Sea Spies. He's going to zoom in live from London to talk about this amazing story about how Mossad smuggled thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the early 1980s. And by the way, there is a film on Netflix about this story that is absolutely fascinating. It's called The Red Sea Diving Resort. And if you subscribe to Netflix, I highly recommend that you watch the movie. The third program that we have coming up, and this is at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, June 2nd, it's The Wolf of Baghdad. And it will feature Carol Isaacs, who is a musician, and she's worked with international artists, and she's a founding member of the London Klezmer Quartet. She is also known as a cartoonist, the Surreal McCoy, and her cartoons have been published in the New Yorker, Sunday Times, and other places. So The Wolf of Baghdad is her first book, and it's based on her own Jewish family's recollections of their lost Iraqi homeland. So we've got some cool stuff coming up. All these programs are free, and you can register for all of them on the library's website. Just go to the website, and at the top of the screen, there's a little ribbon that click on virtual programs, and you'll find the registration forms there. And now, without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker. Margaret Norman received her BA in Food Systems and Public Policy from New York University in 2016, where she completed her senior project as a series of oral histories focused on Jewish life in the Arkansas Delta. That senior project grew from interests in her own family's history and a long-running curiosity about the mashup of Southern and Jewish foodways she saw in her grandmother's cookbook, Fun in the Kitchen. After graduation, Margaret moved to Birmingham, Alabama, where she spent 3 years going between food and farming and public history work. During this time, Margaret continued to pursue projects in Southern Jewish food history and foodways. through documentary and oral history work with the Southern Foodways Alliance and a stint at the history department of the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. In her time at the Institute, Margaret specifically worked on writing for the Florida portion of the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, an online resource of the ISJL, and traveled in Florida visiting and learning from Jewish communities. She is currently the engagement and collaboration coordinator at Temple Beth in Birmingham, Alabama, where her role encompasses programming and outreach, education, and project development for the Bethel Civil Rights Experience, a multimedia project exploring Birmingham's Jewish and civil rights histories. She is also partway through a PhD in American Studies, and in her free time enjoys experimenting with adapting New York deli style and appetizing foods with regionally appropriate ingredients. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me. I have to say I'm very honored to have been invited given the rest of the guest list for this series. It sounds like it's just been a fantastic opportunity to dive into Florida Foodways. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all here. Bear with me for 1 second while I get it on the right slide. And I should say too, before I get started, that we are having a little bit of weather in Alabama. So I am crossing my fingers that I'm going to be on Zoom this whole time, but don't panic if the power cuts off for a second. So before we get started, I want to give you a little bit more background on my Southern Jewish food story to sort of situate myself in this topic. And I know you just heard a little bit in the introduction about some of my professional track and where I've been, but I want to sort of orient myself in this subject tonight. So I grew up in the Northeast in a small town in Vermont, not around many other Jews. I would say my dad, who's on this call right now, is probably my sort of main Jewish contact in that world. We were part of a small congregation, but it was not a large Jewish population. But despite having grown up in the Northeast, my dad grew up in Texas, and the paternal side of his family is sort of firmly from the South. And particularly they came over from Lithuania and Ukraine at the turn of the 20th century, somehow made their way down to rural Arkansas, and by the time I was born, had been there, for about 50 years, part of this small rural community. And as you heard in my introduction, well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, they've been in rural Arkansas for a while. They'd become Reform, over time transitioned away from Orthodoxy. That's a transition we're going to hit on a little bit tonight. But I'd really never had much interest in this history. I was studying food systems and public policy, and I sort of happened to stumble into this elective writing class on Southern Foodways. And our final assignment for that class was to write a profile piece on something. And so I decided to profile the cookbook that you heard referenced in my introduction, this wonderful cookbook from my grandmother. She calls it Fun in the Kitchen. It's really a binder of recipes, but enough to come together into a full book. And those years that my family had spent in the Arkansas Delta had definitely shaped that book, and so had her experiences, in the Midwest, moving south. It was really a mashup of all these different influences. So there were grits and krepla and rolled cabbage with crumbled ginger snaps on top. A lot of the recipes came from this lady here that you see on screen, my Mima. I just love this newspaper clipping from the Osceola Times, and I always include it when I present on this subject. So anyway, I did my senior thesis as a series of oral histories, really trying to understand what it was like to be Jewish in the rural South in the mid-20th century, and I really wanted to go through this lens of food. So I called my project From Rolled Cabbage to Osceola, and in the process of doing that work, I really learned, how much you can tell from a food story. Excuse me 1 second. Even from a single dish. So in that rolled cabbage, there was a story about adaptation. In the pulled pork barbecue, just a few pages later, you could really see the tension between kosher and Treyf. In remembered recipes in this oral history project, you got a sense of sadness and nostalgia, and the story of children moving to cities. And so a few years later, this work eventually brought me to Florida for the first time. I guess I'd actually been to Florida once before to go to Disney World, but I'm not sure if that counts completely. But I traveled through Florida this time with the Institute of Southern Jewish Life as we worked on the Florida portion of the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. And this is really all a long-winded way of saying that, I'm not an expert on Florida Jewish foodways, though I do have some really good stories that I'm going to share with you tonight. But I do understand the power of reading Southern Jewish and Southern and all food stories, because an Americanized recipe for rolled cabbage, it changed my entire trajectory. And I'm hoping that I can sort of share that value with you this evening. So what I really hope to do is to take some of these stories and to share with you also some of the broader Southern Jewish frameworks through which we may read them. And before we go forward, I want to sort of frame the presentation tonight with this pretty simple but elegant quote from what's really the Bible of Southern Jewish foodways. Probably some of you are familiar with this book. This is Marcy Cohen Ferris's Matzo Ball Gumbo, Culinary Tales of the Jewish South. And she says in her introduction, food is a bridge between Southern culture and the Jewish experience. And I want you to keep that in your mind, and we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. And then I also want to share with you, because I think it's important, that in this, this really pivotal work on Southern Jewish foodways, there's no chapter on Florida. And this may or may not surprise you, but it does pose what I think is sort of an essential age-old question of Florida and its place in and apart from the South. And I'm not here to open up that debate. I live in Alabama. I'm familiar with the Florida-Bama area. I know there's good arguments as to why and why not different parts of Florida are and are not the South. But I do think that it's important for framing this conversation, because in some ways Florida has fostered a very usual Southern Jewish experience, and in other ways a really unusual one. So with that, as promised, we are going to start in Micanopy tonight. And what we're going to do is go through 4 different places that I learned about in my work with the Institute. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Jewish food stories that exist in those places. This is where I should also note just sort of a few basic facts about Florida Jewish history. So Florida's first Jews appear not in Micanopy, but in Pensacola in the year 1763, so quite early. A lot of people don't know this, but the sort of the first real wave of Jewish immigration to America was located primarily in the South, in Charleston and Savannah, New Orleans, and some in Pensacola also. So these Jews arrived in Florida actually coming from New Orleans after New Orleans transitioned to Spanish rule. The Spanish were not very well disposed to the Jewish population, less so than the French who had previously held New Orleans. So for the next 50 years, Florida's Jewish population is relatively minimal. Spain regains control. This whole period of history, it's a lot of different territories coming under different rules. But in 1821, the US purchases Florida, and with that comes the sort of religious freedom that encourages more Jewish migrants to start arriving. So this period also sees the arrival of Moses Levy, who's going to be our focus in Micanopy tonight. Levy was a Moroccan-born Jew who migrated to the Caribbean as a child, and as an adult, he migrated then to Florida, made his way to Alachua County, and you can actually see here in this map this large tract of land that he bought right outside of Micanopy. You can see Moses written right on the map there. And here in the tract of land that he purchased, he established Pilgrimage Plantation. And Pilgrimage Plantation was intended to be an agricultural utopia for Jews fleeing violence and repression in Europe. And it was the first Jewish agricultural utopia in America. And some of you are probably at this point wondering, okay, first, what is this actually, a thing that this would be the first of? But throughout the 19th century, there was actually quite a movement among Jewish immigrants and the organizations that helped settle Jewish immigrants in the US to create and foster agricultural communities, intended utopias, as alternatives to urban settlement. I drew a quote here from really the only real book that's been written on this subject, Jewish Agricultural Utopias in America. And Herscher says that these settlers and agencies saw in agriculture a way to prevent a repetition of the unhappy history of the Jew in Europe. As I said, this really became a movement, and Levy was the first to enact this vision on Florida soil. A little bit more about Levy. He was a former slave trader, and his intended utopia included the use of slave labor, and his planting of sugarcane drew directly from his experiences with plantation agriculture in the Caribbean. It also was the first sort of sizable planting of sugarcane in the region. His project only lasted 13 years, and it was eventually burned to the ground by a Seminole tribe nearby. Of course, this is a time where there's a real tension between settlers and Native Americans in the land. And even before that, though, the project had really suffered, as many of these utopias did, from their participants' lack of farming experience. In this case, only 5 Jewish families had sort of bought into Levy's vision and come to join him even after 13 years. And you have to remember that at this point, Jews were barred from holding land in Europe, which means that they were coming to these intended utopias without the skills to really get a farming project off the ground, which I always find a sort of interesting thing, because it's in a way sort of the very conditions that they're trying to get away from are what are holding them back from these projects becoming a success. So there are a few important nuggets, I think, to draw from this story. To me, the complexity of understanding Levy in a slaveholding society situates him in 1820s Northern Florida squarely in the South. He's literally building a utopia on the backs of slave labor. At the same time, he's a complicated figure. He advocated for gradual emancipation. He wrote a document called A Plan for the Abolition of Slavery. And he illuminates several important strands in American Jewish history also. He reminds us that many early Jewish immigrants were Sephardic, having heritage in Spain or in Northern Africa, not necessarily the Ashkenazi populations that we usually associate with American Jewish immigration. And this is at the same time that he's preparing for the first sizable European wave of Jewish migration to the US. And he reminds us too that Jews in diaspora were and always are entangled in the norms and cultures of their setting, in this case, in slaveholding and slave trading. And the beginning of this utopian vision, it tells us about the challenges abroad as much as it does about the hopes and dreams of new American arrivals. So there's a lot to unpack from what was ultimately a 13-year-old, not very successful run at planting sugarcane outside of Micanopy. So from here, I am going to take us to Orlando. That is a place in Florida that I suppose I've been twice. The first Jews arrived in Orlando shortly after 1875. And at this time, Orlando was really a sort of middle ground between what was perceived as Northern Florida, a more settled area, and the sort of wilder south of Florida. And I tell you this to illustrate that moving to Orlando in 1875, it indicates a sort of frontier mindset. And by 1885, there were about a dozen Jewish families that were on board with that project. And this story too is an agricultural one, or at least it starts that way, but it's one of citrus instead of sugarcane, an industry that was fostered by railroad development, the subsequent opening of regional and national markets, even to what at the time was considered sort of faraway Orlando. And these early families, these earliest arrivals, were mainly merchants, which situates them pretty squarely in broader narratives of Southern Jewish life. So my family in Arkansas were merchants too. And there's a common Southern Jewish narrative thread where immigrants arrived as peddlers with little capital and then accumulated enough to eventually establish stores and establish themselves in towns and cities across the American South. But then you see a second wave of immigration to Orlando. Between 1912 and 1913, there was a migration of Jewish families from Pittsburgh, many of whom knew each other, families who wanted to participate in the agricultural economy. Maybe for them, there's even still part of this utopian vision that's lingering. And they participated in citrus and in cattle ranching. And so the Levys are one family. It's a different Levy family though, just a little confusing. And here, I just love this picture. You can see this is actually a wedding of one of the family members. They're in an orange grove. And if you look carefully, you can see that they're actually using a Zionist flag for the huppah. Huppah is a sort of wedding canopy, which is interesting. This is, of course, before the establishment of the state of Israel. And so this tells you a little bit about the politics of the group at the time also. And it wasn't just weddings that were held in the citrus grove. Services were actually led there before the organization of formal Jewish life, led by a man named Israel Shader, an Orthodox Russian immigrant who operated a dairy near Orlando. And we heard all these interesting stories when we were doing this portion of the encyclopedia about how non-Jewish neighbors of Israel's were said to have helped milk the family cows on Shabbat, and how the families worked together too to maintain rituals. For example, with certain members training in kosher slaughter, so that at one point they actually even operated a kosher butcher in the area, even with a sort of small Jewish population. Fast forward a little bit into the mid 20th century, as you'll see in South Florida also, the Jewish population is starting to pick up. At the same time, Jews are also still barred from some social spaces, in particular country clubs and social clubs. But Jews ran kosher and non-kosher restaurants increasingly in the area that were visited by Jews and non-Jews alike. One article I found that I included here, is actually from 1929. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the content of this in a minute, but it's entitled Gentile Cook Can Learn Much from Kosher Chef. Gentile, of course, means non-Jew, which shows that even at a time when Jews were not fully accepted into the population, food, in this case kosher food, becomes this sort of interesting bridge, or at least a conversation between the two. One of the more well-known Jewish-owned restaurants in Orlando, perhaps some people here are even familiar with it if they have experience in Orlando, is Ronnie's Restaurant, a delicatessen-style restaurant. It ran for 39 years in the city, and it was known for its rigid rules. Apparently, you could only receive 2 pats of butter per customer. You couldn't call ahead, couldn't divide checks, you had to use certain doors. Seems very intense. The 1995 article announcing its closing, I found sort of interesting too. It really contextualizes it as part of a string of mom and pop restaurants that closed as Orlando became more and more populated by corporate chains. But I have to say, my favorite thing that I found, I was doing a little more digging on Ronnie to prepare for the presentation today, and I found a very active Facebook group while I was doing a little research called I Miss Ronnie's Restaurant in Orlando. And by very active, I mean that people were posting on it like last week. This is for a restaurant that closed in 1995. And what was great for me is that quite a few people had posted pictures of old menus throughout the years, all the way from the beginning of Ronnie's opening, as well as some of the training documents for employees that actually listed some of those rules that I listed a moment ago. The one thing that I noticed on these menus that I wasn't at all surprised by was the presence of Treyf, or non-kosher foods. And so just for anybody who isn't familiar, kosher is a sort of complex set of Jewish dietary laws, but the 3 big no-nos are no pork, no shellfish, and no mixing meat or milk. And on Ronnie's menu, you of course see New York deli style classics like hot pastrami sandwiches. You also see ham sandwiches and cheeseburgers and shellfish galore. And to me, you know, in Southern Jewish food stories, kosher sometimes almost feels like a character of its own. Its rejection or acceptance signals relationships, views on Jewish practice, and tensions between Jewish, American, Floridian. And I think that those tensions are really to be found all over some of these stories from Orlando that I've gone through. So in the history of early migrants, you see these services in citrus groves, the establishment of a kosher butcher. You see the resilience of a people determined to maintain tradition, and you see these complex relationships. They're receiving help from their non-Jewish neighbors at the same time that they're still barred from some spaces. It isn't surprising to me that kosher slaughter would be a prioritized practice at that time, but like many American Jewish populations, and certainly Southern Jewish populations, certainly my own family would fit this category. You know, while some would have maintained those customs, others would have relaxed them over time, because of course, some of the most Treyf foods are also really important foods in the South. So let's return to a moment too to this 1929 article, because it's sort of interesting what they're praising around kosher foods. This article calls kosher foods wholesome, appetizing, and above all things, clean and pure. Again, this is in 1929, and so this also sort of fits this complement really squarely into sort of increasing broader American food trends towards health and sanitation. This is when you're sort of seeing more and more processed foods, etc. So it's just another way in which these seemingly small stories actually can really signal larger food trends. So next on our whirlwind tour, I'm going to take us to Daytona Beach. So we're working our way a little bit more towards your area. The arrival of Jewish migrants in Daytona was later than some of the places we've discussed so far. Jews mostly came to Daytona after the turn of the century as part of a sort of snowbird culture that was developing across the state, again, with sort of the help of the railroad, the same innovation that supported citrus in Orlando. And so the first known Jews in Daytona were Jacob and Annie Ginsburg. They were Polish immigrants who owned a Panama hat store. So they also sort of fit into this mercantile narrative. Several other families followed them after the turn of the century to join, to also establish their own businesses. You know, this is sort of what we saw with the Pittsburgh migration in Orlando also, that often these sort of waves of migration do happen with folks who know each other in one place and follow one another down. So while a handful of families did settle in the early 20th century and begin to organize Jewish life, another thing that was interesting is that, you know, more and more you were also seeing the sort of tourist culture that I'm sure you all see in South Florida. And there were many Jewish families that were participating in that sort of seasonal transient culture. And so for decades, their organized Jewish life actually really fluctuated throughout the year. So they would have people who would come and be part of the congregation for a few months, go back, and they don't actually organize a formal congregation until 1924. So as in Orlando, even in the mid 20th century, Jews were barred from certain places, particularly, like I said, social clubs and select neighborhoods. And this is where I do want to say that, because I haven't yet, the type of discrimination that Jews experienced was much different than what the African American population would have saw at the same time. Marcy Cohen Ferris, in her book Matzo Ball Gumbo, which I referenced earlier, calls this benign discrimination. So the type of exclusion that I was speaking about, not necessarily the full force of Jim Crow segregation, or certainly the threats of violence, etc. And I don't know enough to hit on Florida Jews and civil rights. I think that could probably be its own lecture, or to tell you any relevant food stories around that. But I will say that generally Jews in the mid 20th century experienced a real push and pull between whiteness and distinctiveness, and in the context of very charged times, of course. And that Southern Jewish foodways have certainly been influenced by African American cooking, in particular African American domestic help, some of whose stories Marcy explores beautifully in her book. So if that's the subject you'd like to learn more about, I would definitely recommend Matzo Ball Gumbo. So as in Orlando, the end of World War II sees, as I said, this sort of boom in tourist culture, particularly thanks to the development of NASCAR in the Daytona context, and of course the white sand beaches. And as the 20th century comes to a close, there's a sort of new type of snowbird who's coming to town, and these are Soviet refugees. In fact, in the late 1980s, I thought this was a kind of fun story when I found it for the first time. The Daytona Beach Jewish Federation actually adopts a family, the Schechters. They're coming over from the Ukraine area, and the family moves to Daytona and eventually comes to run this place called the Carousel Motel. And they serve their familiar foods to other Soviet and Jewish tourists, both new arrivals who are coming and settling from across the sea, and snowbirds coming down from New York looking for old world Jewish foods on the beach. And what's interesting about this story too is that the adoption of the Schechters, if you sort of look more closely at that story, it marks a really interesting turn in American Jewish life and history. An era in the latter part of the century where Jews who not so long ago, as I said, had sort of felt that push and that pull and that tension between distinctiveness and blending in, actually sort of re-embraced concepts of Jewish ethnicity and turned towards distinctly Jewish causes like the freedom of Soviet Jews and support for the state of Israel. So before we go on, oh, and I should say that this clipping that I have here is from a 1990 article called Moscow on the Beach. I'll actually read it to you all because I think it's really fun. So the clipping says, a standard lunch for the Soviet emigre guests in November: beef stroganoff, fried potatoes, pickled salad, fruit and bread, meals you might need to nap after, although the tables of emigres tuck them in with frightening ease. Some of them root, hopefully, through the bread baskets to get at the garbushki, don't actually know exactly how to say that, the crunchy heels from Lydia's home-baked loaves the size of toaster ovens. Matt whisks some menus out from the kitchen. He pauses to consult with the table. You don't want that, it's just American salad, he tells a customer. And I just really love that line at the end because, again, before we go on, I'll just encourage you to think back a moment to Ronnie's, whose Jewish owners really presented a mostly Americanized menu with some Jewish deli shout-outs. So in the mid-20th century, Jewish restaurant owners who are still in this context where they're barred from certain spaces, are navigating those tensions, would have felt the need to cater more extensively to a broader population. And of course, this is all speculation because it's possible that Ronnie also just loved ham sandwiches. But in the 1990s, when the Schechters arrive, There is sort of maybe more room for presentation of some of these foods, and it's possible that there's something that runs deeper behind the two menus that really speaks to food and expression and acceptability. So my last stop on our tour today is Miami, and I've titled it A Whole Other World, in part to admit that I've never actually been to South Florida. So I wrote a little bit about it when I was with the ISJL, but I didn't actually travel there. And I've never been to Delray Beach, and I'm hoping that some of you all may have food stories to share with me that you'll be able to teach me a little bit about, about where you're from in your context, and maybe have some Jewish food stories to share also. But I still do have, a few little tidbits that I can put out there for us today. So like any good Jewish food scholar, despite never having been, I've heard of the classics, namely Wolfie Cohen's and Joe's stone crab. And in fact, when I was first asked to do this presentation, the first thing that came to mind was a story from my grandmother, which is just one of my favorites. So in this story, she is visiting an Uncle Morty or Morton in Florida. My dad can correct me if he'd like, because he's on this call. But as she tells it, she and her sister-in-law would go to visit and would roll up to Joe's stone crab for some key lime pie. They'd look at the line, so he's very long apparently, and then they would walk right to the front, tell them Uncle Morty's name, and go right in, skipping the whole line. She's told me this story maybe 10 or 15 times. And I'm honestly, to this day, not really sure what's implied in the story. Was he highly influential? Was he like a member of the Jewish mob? What are his connections that they're able to skip this line? But what I really love about this story is that it tells you something really wonderful about my grandmother, which is that if she's going to work the system, it's definitely going to be to skip the line at Joe's stone crab and get some key lime pie. So that's my one Miami story, my one personal Miami story. But I do have a few other things that I can tell you about Miami Jewish foodways. So there were not all that many settlers in South Florida before 1900, including Jews. I do know that Joe's stone crab was opened by a Hungarian Jew named Joe Weiss in 1920, undoubtedly the first Jewish-owned restaurant in the area. And he actually didn't serve crabs until after 1921. He started off just serving fish. I guess somebody brought him the crabs in 1921 and they figured out you could eat them. So while the Jewish population grew in the early 20th century, it really boomed after World War II, along with cities like Daytona and Orlando. But I think this boom was, as I understand it, particularly intense in the South Florida area, and really made South Florida a center of American Jewish life. I believe the statistic is that South Florida is the third largest center of American Jewish life today, something like at least 7% of the American Jewish population. So servicemen who trained in Florida came back from war wanting to return to Miami's beaches. And Miami also saw an influx of Jewish retirees in that era. In fact, I just watched a wonderful movie that I would recommend to anybody called The Last Resort, that paints a really poignant picture of how important Miami was to these older Jewish men and women who had labored in sweatshops in New York or fled the Holocaust before coming to Miami, and that it was really a taste of paradise for these people. And so on the right, you see a picture from that movie shot by Andy Sweet, whose photographs I learned about in the documentary and are also wonderful. And these men and women, of course, really fueled the iconic delicatessens of South Florida. So the last book that I wanted to show you all today, Ted Merwin's History of Jewish Deli, Pastrami on Rye. And in it, he quotes a woman named Judith Nelson Drucker, whose family came to Miami, which she calls the shtetl on the sea, in the 1940s, after her father retired from the garment industry. And she talks about her dad taking trips up to New York to schlep back salamis before delis really started to develop. Delis, which like Ronnie's in Orlando, became vital gathering places and social spaces for Jews and non-Jews alike. And I kind of liked that tidbit because even in a new paradise, people still have a desire for old foods and will go to all sorts of lengths to obtain them. So Wolfie Cohen's was born as a sandwich shop in the 1930s, grew into the celebrity-packed all-night food empire. I'm sure some of you all have been there, and I'd love to hear more about it. So I also, of course, can't talk about Miami or Florida without talking about the Caribbean influence. And I actually was going to play you all a short clip. Let's see. Oh, it's 6:40 though. I do want to leave time for Q&A. So, I'm actually going to skip my short clip because I really want to give you all some time to ask questions, and think some have already come through. But I will say that Joan Nathan has a whole episode on Jewish cooking in America, on what she calls Jubano, Jewish Cuban cuisine. And it's really excellent and a great place to learn more. But what I think that also looking at that sort of culinary mashup too, not just sort of Southern Jewish, but Southern Jewish Cuban can do is it can remind us of a few things. So the person in the clip that I was going to play you, her family originated in Spain, moved to Turkey, then to Cuba, then to Florida. And she talks about how all of these wanderings have really shaped her family's cuisines. And Jews, of course, are a diasporic people. So all of these foodways have been shaped in all these different places along the way. For my family, it's Eastern Europe to the Northeast, to the Midwest, to the South. And then looking at any sort of Jewish cuisine, Florida or otherwise, I think that that's a really powerful thing to keep in mind. So to conclude, there are a few things that I hope you take away from this not all comprehensive, but I hope intriguing selection of Southern Jewish food stories. I hope you see how much food reveals. Food can really be a jumping off point to learn about hopes and dreams, anxieties, tensions, relationships, negotiations, pertinent to a people, history, culture, journey. And using foodways as a lens, as I think you've seen throughout this series, I'm sure, hardly has a unique benefit to Judaism. But because Jews, as I said, are these sort of wandering people who have navigated new and diverse contexts over thousands of years, food does hold this potential as a universal medium, and as Marcy Cohen Ferris said, as a bridge between understanding the Southern context and the Jewish experience. And so I'm excited now to have a little bit of time to be in conversation with you all. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Let's see.
Well, that was fabulous. Thank you so much, Margaret. Wow, what a story, what a journey. It's just amazing. And I'm wondering if, let's see if we have what we have for questions or comments. Let's see. I'm looking here. Okay. Anne makes the comment about ethnicities, food choices, and reasons for that each speaker in this series is, yeah, it's true. Food equals life and life equals food. Yes, that's the idea. That's that bridge we're talking about. And food is the source of life, and how many different ethnic groups have met together around the table. Yeah, I think the way to peace sometimes is through good food. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Margaret tonight?
And I'm going to put that link to the Jubano episode in the chat so that anybody who's interested in learning more about that mashup can learn more also.
Cool, thank you.
But yeah, if you all have questions, I'm happy to take them, or if you have Florida Jewish food stories that you'd like to share, there's always more to learn. So I'm happy to hear from you all also.
And if you don't want to use the chat box because we're not like super overcrowded, you can unmute yourself and just shout it out.
Oh yeah, I think I see Denny maybe waving her hand.
Yes, I have a funny story. We used to come down from New York to Florida, driving down with my parents and my grandparents. And we do a lot of the trip pre-planned, but as we got close to Florida and into Florida, as a child, I was sent in ostensibly as they pull into the parking lot of a restaurant they weren't familiar with to ask to use the restroom. But I was being sent in to check out what kind of food was being served, and did it smell Jewish, and did it smell clean? And then I had to come out and report to my grandparents, and then they would decide if it was okay to go in there and eat. And I hated it. I absolutely hated spying on these restaurants. It was the nightmare part of my trip until we got down to Miami.
Wow.
That is a great story. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. I did see a question come in. Where do you find the best Jewish food in Alabama? I probably have a really disappointing answer to that, which is that there's not a lot of great Jewish food in Alabama. Probably the best Jewish food in Alabama is cooked by my non-Jewish husband, to be completely honest. He actually does some of the cooking for our synagogue, and he is a fantastic chef of Jewish foods. But we don't have a lot of, we've got very bad bagels, and we don't have a lot of like Jewish deli or anything like that. So that's my disappointing answer to that question.
There's a lot of Jewish delis, you know, in and around our area. But as a Gentile, I mean, I love corned beef. I don't know if that's really Jewish or not, but it's like, I wouldn't know a real Jewish deli from a non-Jewish deli. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like, but we just have delis like practically on every corner down here. So I don't know how you distinguish what makes it authentic. You know, maybe you can answer that question.
No, it's a really good question, and it's a really good point. And yeah, it's funny, you know, when I have worked with undergrad students around Jewish foodways before, I always sort of ask them like, what is Jewish food? Because when you say Jewish food, that is a hard question to answer. There's nothing, it's not like, you know, my ancestors back in Lithuania were eating pastrami sandwiches. You know, that is a total American innovation. And so it really does beg the question of how foods get associated with different groups of people, and who different categories of foods are sort of associated with or belong to. So my answer would be that there are probably a lot of answers to that question. And that it really shows you how complex sort of naming something can be.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have a question or a comment for Margaret?
I'm Margaret's father, and I, you know, Margaret, there's so much, as you were talking, there's so much about our past as a family that I'd never really thought about that way before. One of which is, I never really thought till you were talking tonight that when we plan trips, when my parents planned trips, when my grandparents planned trips, we never planned actually where we were actually going to, how we would get there, the highways, or what we would do once we got there. Everything was about the places we would stop to eat on the way and the restaurants we would eat at the other end. And it's all about food and conversation.
Wow, I love that.
Yeah, I recently saw my grandma for the first time since COVID, and I think all we did was eat together.
So what kind of food do you eat when you get together with your family?
When I get together with my
family,
family,
like what are the dishes that are on your family table?
Well, to be honest, when I get together with my Jewish family, it's mostly a lot of pork barbecue, which again, I think tells you a lot about some of the, you know, about the Southern Jewish experience. I mean, they're probably the only people I know who have, you know, both turkey and pulled pork on their Thanksgiving table. So
I love that.
I see one interesting comment that's come in. Anne says, somehow we're mixing up religion with ethnicity, and you wouldn't do that with Italian food. So the Jewish food I know is from my husband's Polish family roots. I think that's a really good point. You know, Judaism is, you know, far from the only identity like this, but it is, I think, a complex identity where you do have sort of a portion of people who somehow identify as secular and Jewish at the same time. So there is sort of Judaism as a religion and Judaism as a culture. And of course, you know, I've said the word diaspora a few times throughout this presentation, and probably should have, you know, sort of better defined that at some point. But this is really the idea, right, that the Jews have been sort of without any sort of real homeland for about the last 2,000 years. And so a lot of what we think of as Jewish foods are foods that are picked up in context throughout time. So yeah, so Jewish food, a lot of Jewish food is just Polish food, and a lot of American Jewish food is just deli food. Of course, some of those, you know, sometimes you can see, you know, I've seen this a little bit in looking at like Eastern European Jewish foodways, a way in which amongst observant populations, when sort of pre-Reform Judaism in Europe, that local dishes were altered to be kosher or to fit into dietary law. And that's a much more simple way to look and see, you know, oh, this stew that is not necessarily kosher has been made kosher, and so now it's a Jewish food. it gets a lot more tricky when kosher becomes sort of less of a category, you know, and then it does make it harder to sort of pull that out. And I kind of wonder if maybe that's a good thing too. You know, like I said, I think naming things can get sticky. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your comment. Oh, I think Maxine has a hand raised. Oh, you're on mute. Just
good. Thank you. So I wanted to mention that we have terrific availability generally here in South Florida of kosher or Jewish style, kosher style foods. And while I'm far from observant myself, when it comes to Passover, I tend to try to be a little more observant. Somehow 8 days are a lot more doable than 365. So I was in a Publix one year and asked if they had any kosher for Passover cake. And the fellow in the bakery department offered me hot cross buns.
well, I guess it's the gesture that counts, but that is funny. I mean, we certainly, I certainly in Alabama see lots of well-intentioned of gestures like that. So I'll say that I agree with you. I don't keep kosher the rest of the year, but I do try to stay kosher for Passover. So Passover is an interesting thing. I know a lot of people who sort of set that aside as sacred space where they might not necessarily observe the rest of the year. Yeah, Andrea, I think, has a hand.
Yeah, has anybody heard of flanken? My mother was the queen of flanken. I don't even think people talk about it. I don't even know how to make it, but she made brisket and stuffed cabbage and kosher vanishkas. And my father loved her cooking. And I find that my local Publix, even though it's right outside a community that's probably 3/4 Jewish, first this year is serving the 5-pound box of matzahs. You know, in the past, you'd have to buy 1 box of matzah at a time. So even though it's, quote, Jewish here in Boynton Beach, Publix you have to go to Glicks. You'd have to go to a kosher market to get the bulk of, quote, Jewish blintzes and things that are typically Jewish cooking, you know, Jewish food. So you would think maybe there's more in Miami or Fort Lauderdale, but certainly unless you go to the kosher market, which is small, just recently went glatt kosher, which meant the prices doubled. So a brisket for Passover could cost $50 and serve 4, you know.
Oh my gosh. Andrea, I'm dying to know, what is flanken? I've never heard of that before.
She made it with sauerkraut. So does anybody, I don't, it's like beef, and it's kind of like stewed, maybe like a brisket type thing with a kind of reddish, watery, sounds disgusting, right? Watery tomato sauce. But my father loved it. When they lived in an apartment, it stunk up the halls, and the stuffed cabbage also stunk up the halls, you know, up and down. But yeah, it's like, I would say a stewed beef, kind of a stewed potted beef. And gosh, am I the last generation that's going to know what flanken is? Maybe I need to research it. You know?
Oh, I'm gonna make it now. I mean, I love discovering a new, you know, food that I haven't heard of, and I mean, maybe it's just me, but it actually sounds delicious. I made a sauerkraut stew not that long ago. It's like a Polish stew,
and it has like a reddish sauce.
Yeah,
like
I'm kind of wondering if
diluted,
that was
like a diluted tomato sauce kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Sheila, I think has a.
I grew up with flanken.
Okay,
So I
good.
know what it is, but I could not put it in my mouth. It looks so disgusting. But I know what it is.
It was chewy meat anyway.
It was disgusting looking.
Chewy, stringy.
Very interesting.
Ethnic, very ethnic.
Well, now you all have given me something new to learn about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, boiled beef, somebody said, yeah.
Yeah, that raised some comments in the chat box about flunking. Take a look, Margaret.
It's not just you, Andrea. There's a few people on this call that remember flunking.
Oh, okay.
Wow. This is great. This has been a great, I've learned a lot. I'm like really thrilled with this. I don't know, we're just.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I saw someone ask if I could put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to do that. I know I threw a lot of information at you all, so please, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.
That would be great.
I wanted to ask you, how did Jews get to Alabama? I mean, that's like the last place I expected to find Jews. I mean, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I'll say, so in Birmingham, our Jewish population has been here pretty much since the beginning of the city. Birmingham's a post-Civil War city, so they came in the 1870s when the city was established. But even it's really interesting because the first Jews in Birmingham were actually mostly coming from other parts of Alabama and had been here through the Civil War. So when you're thinking about, I guess, Southern Jewish history, it's important to remember that there were some actual major ports in the South. Particularly New Orleans and Charleston, I mentioned earlier. So there were early Jewish populations that came through directly, through the South, not necessarily through like Ellis Island or other ports in the North. And then there are also, my family who lived in Arkansas, it's kind of a mystery. We know that they came from Eastern Europe to Boston, and then from there went to the Midwest and sort of down. And the story is that they were following relatives or friends who were already there, but yeah, whether those friends came through southern ports or came through northern ports is hard to know. But yeah, Birmingham has a pretty established Jewish population and has gone through sort of two major waves of migration of folks who've been here a long time.
She just put her email address in the chat box if you would like to make a note of it. Before we close out and say goodnight, we maybe have another minute or so for another question or comment. Anyone?
Well, if anyone has a good flunkin recipe, please send it my way.
Oh my.
How does a temple have a food expert? We're basically trying to stay afloat and joining temples together. How do you come to have a food expert as part of your staff kind of thing?
So probably important to say that my title is not, my job at the temple is not food expert, although I think sometimes they benefit from it. So I actually work mostly on programming and engagement, and I do some public history work for the temple, but it's not food related necessarily. But I have done academic work in American Jewish history. I'm doing my graduate work in American Jewish history right now. And for me, I thought it would be a really neat opportunity to actually work in a synagogue and organize Jewish life while I'm doing that work. So they're sort of two separate parts of my life, but they're certainly related. But most of my job at the temple is not food expert.
Oh,
So I wish it was. That would be fun.
That's great. Thank you so much, Margaret, for your time and your preparation and for presenting all of this fascinating history and a look at our state and the Jewish foodways in our state. I found it amazing, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it too. I think we had some great conversation and great questions and comments. So thank you everyone for being here. Margaret, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Stay safe from that rash of storms you're having up there. And I hope that I will see you all around the Zoom room again soon for other programs that we have coming up. And with that, I guess I will say, wish you all the best and say good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me. It's so great to meet you all.